Hi, this is Stephen Brower from Rock Valley Community College, and this is meant to be the overview for Chapter 1, which is the Introduction to Operating Systems. Before getting into an overview of the material, I just want to then go and bring up the slides for Chapter 1. So I'm in the modules right now, which we either can go through modules or the Home tab, bring up the modules. So open the module for Introducing Operating Systems, and I'm going to open or click on this link here for the 2 per page. And although there is this sort of a view from within here, what I do want, or what I want to do is I'm going to download the PDF. Because it's a little easier to look at the slides this way. So in many of the, let me go back on this one here. So in many of the modules, I have both a 2 per and a 6 per page in terms of the slides. And the idea is if you're going to print the 6 per page, well, being that this is this right here is 20 pages, which is the 2 per page. And if you print it double-sided, it would be 10 pieces of paper. But anyway, the 6 per page is obviously a lot less paper. So it's the kind of thing, if you're printing, you're probably going to use the 6 per page. If you're viewing, you probably want to use the 2 per page. So I just kind of wanted to mention that first before jumping into some of the stuff that's going on within this chapter itself. There's a lot of information in this first Chapter 1, and part of it's because it's an overview of the entire book. So what's introduced in here, besides the fact of what an operating system is, but are the subsystems. So there are going to be later chapters that cover the subsystems. And so let me just, so the subsystems. So this chapter is introducing the memory manager, the process manager, the device manager, and the file manager. But we're going to have later in the course 2 chapters on memory, a chapter on processes, a chapter on devices, and a chapter on files, or file management. So there's going to be 5 chapters on these topics that are introduced here in this chapter. The idea behind the memory, behind the subsystems, is they focus on a specific item. So the memory manager is focusing on managing the memory. The processor manager is focusing on managing the process. The device manager is focusing on devices. The file manager is really focusing on the organization of files. Now these all have to work together, because if we make a request for a file, well, the device manager and the file manager have to work together in order to get the file. If that file is being loaded into memory, you have to work with the memory manager, and then all this is being executed in terms of code, which is being managed by the process manager. So these subsystems they all work together. And so what's introduced in this chapter is a little bit into how these different subsystems sort of work together. And this is trying to show here sort of the connections between these subsystems that take place. The user interface then is us interfacing with the operating system, and then a later subsystem we're going to take a look at is the network manager, which is specifically for in terms of, well, we're initially going to look myopically. In other words, we're going to look very narrowly at a computer, and then for any communication in or out from the network, it's the network manager that would control that. And we're going to have 2 chapters later on networking. So again, this chapter, this introductory chapter, if it seems overwhelming, it is. It is a lot all at once. But for right now, it's just more for us to get sort of the overview of each of these different subsystems. It's the later chapters are going to go into much more detail about what all these subsystems do in terms of a little more specifics. So this chapter is just sort of introducing us to the subsystems, and then later chapters will go into more, much more detail. I think in terms of this, let me pause for a second. Sorry, one more thing. So the latter part of the chapter, one of the things that it does is it gets into the different categories of operating systems. And when giving the history of batch operating systems, it makes it seem as if that's the only place in which batch is done. But the idea of a batch based operating system is that there's no interaction with the user for the running of the tasks or the processes that are being carried out. So our computers that we're using can run things in batch. So if you think of something like the scheduling of the antivirus software to do a full scan like every Thursday night at 11 p.m. or something like that, there's no user interaction required for that. So the batch, although the book does describe it based on what the initial batch systems were, batch still exists. Or I should say batch processing still exists. In terms of a dedicated operating system, not so much, because what we really have now are hybrid. So our computers that we use are really hybrid operating systems because they are both interactive, because they interact with the user, but things can also be run without the user. Anyway, so the latter part of the chapter gets into the categories of the operating systems. I think this is just sort of enough of an overview for right now, and I said it before, I'll just say it one more time. This introductory chapter introduces a lot of topics. Don't be overwhelmed by it, and there'll be later chapters that go into more detail on a number of the topics introduced.